John Calvin was born July 10th, 1509, and he was on his way to Strasbourg in 1536 to live as a biblical scholar, kind of as a recluse. And he was diverted by an imperial troop movement, and he was forced to readjust his journey, which would take him directly through Geneva. In his overnight stay in Geneva, Guillaume Farel, a Genevan preacher, saw Calvin stop in Geneva as kind of this godsend, and Farel was able to convince overnight this socially anxious Calvin to come help reform and hopefully all of France. So when Farel and Calvin arrived in Geneva, Reformation had already begun in full swing, and the Roman Catholic clergy had, for the most part, fled that town. This left a kind of religious vacuum that was being attempted to be filled in by the Protestant leadership. Calvin's first Reformation attempt at Geneva fell flat, didn't work. And when the General Council of Geneva met in 1537, they voted down Calvin's all-encompassing confession of faith that he wanted for all of Geneva. And they regarded Calvin at the same time as just kind of another political agent of the religion, and not as a genuine Christian Protestant. Because Calvin did not want civil councils of Geneva to determine practice at communion, and because of Calvin and Farel's defiance of the Genevan government's orders for communion practice, these two men, Farel and Calvin, were given 3 days to leave Geneva. This led Calvin to Strasbourg, France, and because of the Reformation-minded Martin Bucer of Strasbourg, he already had a pastoral position ready for Calvin when he got into Strasbourg. Strasbourg was not Geneva. Strasbourg was more cosmopolitan, more tolerant, more loosely associated with the political powers that would be than Geneva and their close knit relationship with the government there. Calvin's relationship and Calvin's Reformation ideas took a deeper root within Strasbourg, and Martin Bucer helped educate Calvin on how to more ecumenically get along with the other churches, the churches that had a Lutheran and Zwinglian background in Strasbourg. So for Calvin, Strasbourg became his home base, and he attended several ecumenical Reformation conferences, Regensburg, St. William's Colloquies, Frankfurt. He did this all while still trying to hold on to the tenets of the Augsburg Confession. Calvin also reinforces his Institutes of the Christian Religion, and other commentary that he has published on different books of the Bible is getting published at the same time as well. Calvin was also very good at keeping away a Roman influence in Strasbourg. His strongest, most crucial way in doing this was in response to Cardinal Sadoletto's letter to Geneva, and he's asking Cardinal Sadoletto, who is representing Roman Catholicism, he's asking people in Strasbourg and in Geneva now, why are you leaning towards this Reformation? It's time to come back into the fold. And Calvin, the people of Geneva, the magistracy of Geneva, give this letter to Calvin saying, Calvin, why don't you answer Cardinal Sadoletto and the Roman Catholics? Calvin eloquently defends sola scriptura. He does that Luther style, and then and everybody's pleased. And Cardinal Sadoletto kind of takes a back seat. There's not very many more letters from Cardinal Sadoletto after that defense. Now, in 1540, Calvin is married to the widow of an Anabaptist. Her name is Idelette Buer, and all seems at peace in Strasbourg until Calvin is forcibly called back to Geneva again by this very convicting, very fervid Guillaume Farel. So in this church right now that I'm in, St. Thomas, this is the church that Calvin preached at. He was a part of for 3 years, thanks to Martin Bucer. He was here for 3 years in what would be called the Genevan exile after his first time, but now he was getting called back to Geneva. And he's getting called back, and is being called back by his buddy Guillaume Farel again, and he feels that it's God's leading that is bringing him there. And this time, he is to be the pastor of St. Peter in Geneva. So while Roman Catholicism still had some holdouts in parts of Strasbourg, namely Catholic convents, the city itself was not so much beholden to the Augsburg Confession. The city really was more interested in helping keep Strasbourg a very tolerant, open, ecumenical kind of city, and still having its economical, social, religious needs being met. This seems very much a contrast to Calvin's eventual Geneva, to the Geneva that he is going to shape, that he's going to reform. Because Strasbourg itself, this town of Strasbourg, showed cooperation with the Wittenberg Concord, which did allow more imperial cities to join more Reformation-minded cities in southwest Germany. It's that, again, that kind of ecumenical spirit that was there. And that included Strasbourg. If Calvin had stayed in Strasbourg, the question could be asked, would Calvin have kept a more pluralistic approach to denominational relationships compared to how he eventually dominated Geneva? I mean, it's an interesting contrast between the two. And so today when people say, you know, I'm called by God, I'm called by God, John Calvin had said that in certain locations and ministries, and so in our lives in certain locations and ministries, we have to say, am I called by God? Am I compelled to hear? Am I compelled to there? Because God is leading me that way. And have I counted the cost? Have I counted the consequence? Because for Calvin, in both Geneva and Strasbourg, there was cost and there was consequence. In a time where a lot of people seek a perfect situation to serve God, it could be well worth to consider not only the cost and the consequence of serving God, but the faithfulness of God in any ministry, in any location and situation. This church itself, where I'm speaking from, Strasbourg and St. Thomas, this church was built in the early 1200s, early 13th century. And even though Calvin was here for 3 years, he did some of his finest work here, away from the pressures of Geneva, where he would fully flesh out his institutes of Christian religion. And that is a little bit of Strasbourg. Thank you.